Hello, everybody. So I'm calling in from Brussels, Belgium. I see people from all over Europe, from North America, South America. So great to have such a global audience with us today to discuss participation and engagement workflows and how we can supercharge them with GoVocal and sharing some of the tips we have. But before we kick off with the agenda, I just want to say that there's live translation available in Zoom. So if English is not your first language, you can just toggle that on, and then you can either listen or read the captions. So that's very practical for people who prefer this. And today, Irene and myself will be your hosts. I'm one of the co-founders at GoVocal and I lead our government success team. And Irene is our head of product. So we're very excited to walk you through this agenda today. So first we'll introduce to you why we're here. Why do we think that participation workflows are important? We think they are important because we see that participation is more and more becoming infrastructure for local governments. We're going to talk about that. And then the main chunk of the webinar will be sharing 5 ways, tips to improve your participation workflow today. So we hope you'll walk away with at least one tip you'll implement right after. The goal is to finish, in 45 minutes in total, and so that we have at least at the end 10 minutes for Q&A. So please share all of your questions in the Q&A bubble. You can also just use the chat module if you want to share some thoughts. So kicking it off, and over to Irene.
Hi everyone, really happy to be here. Excited to then have a Q&A and chat a bit more. But I wanted to share a bit of what we were up to also at the end of last year. And in December, we reached out to all the organizations, all the municipalities that we serve with one question. That was, how do you work? We were obsessing over the question of how does the day-to-day, not the general take on participation, but how does the nitty-gritty work of running participation and engagement projects actually look like? And mind you, we serve small to medium to really large organizations. Some of them work in very centralized ways, others work in very decentralized ways. So we were expecting a wide range of responses. And as we started to dig into the data and go a bit deeper, a pretty clear picture started to emerge. And many of the respondents told us, actually, there's like an 8-step, roughly, workflow that you can move forward, Aline, with the slides.
Oh.
There's about an 8-step workflow that we most of the time go through when we are running consultations. Next slide. And it roughly looks like this. We most of the time start from the envisioning process, right? We come together, or we, on passing in the office, we start to chat and envision what we might do, what we might launch, what question we might pose to the public that maybe connects back to a policy, connects back to a local plan. We move on to actually building the project page on your platform. And then comes in sometimes long, sometimes, a longer process than you would like to around maybe approvals, reviews, quality assurance, but super important also to your job, eventually to really launch and start really receiving contributions from your community. And then the challenge becomes moderation, engagement, providing feedback to the community that you are consulting with. And later on, blending both the input that you have received offline, because many of the organizations and the municipalities also present, even if you don't work with us, I assume, devote lots of resources, right, to the offline component of participation. So the blending of that input with your online efforts becomes also like a big step in the process. And to conclude, the respondents told us that there were 3 steps to a bit more of the closing of the participatory consultation process. An evaluation step, where sometimes the work has to do with really evaluating inputs from a perspective of feasibility, responding to them, digging into the data, trying to find insights and trying to find trends. for what? To eventually be able, right, to report back, to be able to say, this is what we heard from the community, this is what the decision that we are going to move forward is, and report back also to management. So this was a bit of the picture that emerged from the data, or from the responses, and maybe some of you, please comment on the chat. I'm curious about this. You might already be kind of thinking, yeah, right. My day to day is way messier than this. I can break this down into thousand problems that emerge every day. So share with us. We've condensed those 8 steps into 5, I think, in the poll. But which
Mhm.
parts of this workflow are currently really the most challenging to you? We would be really curious to hear more on. Our response is starting to come in, Aline.
I'm not seeing
Or
them, so I
DM, do
think
you see
Guillaume
them?
is seeing them.
Maybe you can feed us the results.
Yes. Boom, 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 boom. All right.
Oh, there we go. So parts that you find challenging, analysis and reporting at the front, followed by, I think, very closely by closing the loop and design, setup, and moderation are a bit almost very close to each other. This actually, it's interesting because it very much matches the results of that survey that I was alluding to that we ran at the end of the year. Um, so the reality is a bit messier, right? When we start to look at each of those steps. And if you go to the next slide, Aline,
Yes.
we quickly in the data started to see a bit of a secondary story, one that spoke to this idea that yes, there is a workflow, there are certain steps that you always go through, but the operating model behind it, the real workflow of collaboration with your colleagues and to really making it happen is not that clear. What many of these organizations that we serve told us was still like the setup and the decision making around consultations is quite informal and reactive. Like we are still very much deciding things by email. Sometimes I get an idea for a consultation in a Zoom call and then we launch it, but there's not often not long horizon of planning around it. The planning itself is super fragmented. Some of the mediums and toolings that people were mentioning also in the survey refer to spreadsheets, calendars, inboxes, in some cases, handwritten notes that get passed on. Of course, every department was working in a different way, partly because culturally there's also different standards, but also because there was an infrastructure lacking there, right, to standardize processes as well as to how to run consultations. The review of the inputs also done in a way that really depended on the individual that was doing it rather than on more of a standardized way that the administration or the organization had set up for everyone. And then very, very interesting, as many of you seem to be really struggling with reporting and analysis, this idea that reporting, even in the era, right, that we talk about AI and reporting still an analysis at the level of work that you do, and especially working with the public and with the importance of always needing to trust the data and to have legitimacy in the analysis, is still being like very much a manual process for you. And lastly, the bucket around closing the loop, reporting. About 75% or so of respondents in the survey alluded to want to do more of, really struggle with this step. We often or rarely are able to actually do so. So as we saw this picture emerge, next slide, please, we started to ask ourselves if indeed we are serving organizations that are becoming more mature, that really are embracing this idea of mandated habitual participation, that is not just a one-off, but it's really an always-on workflow and track that they really have to empower others to really embrace. What are the systems and tools that we can continue to build, right? So we spent 2025 really building functionality and features in tool to support, and we'll break those down a little bit more to support those workflows that are a bit complex. But we are looking also to a 2026 full of development also around that area. On to you, Aline.
All right. So I think Irene has already shared a bit like how we look at workflows, mostly also from a product point of view, right? What can we do? But I think when we, as government success, so the my team is advising and working with local governments. I think everything always starts with one project or a series of projects. So often when we start working together with local engagement, participation teams, they have ideas of like, okay, we want to launch this mobility project or this spatial planning project. But eventually, at some point, every government needs to invest some skills and resources to build capacity, capabilities to make sure that there's a shared approach across teams and projects, because if not, it will be something that is, yeah, not scalable, and that there will be lots of time and resources wasted. And that's something that we have seen also as a trend last year, that more and more local governments, no matter the size, are really investing in this. So, what are we seeing that is actually changing? Well, three things are changing. First, how teams work together. So often every department is kind of doing their own thing, but we see more and more shared approaches. It can be centralized, where one team, communication team, engagement team, is really kind of advising other teams, or it can be decentralized. There's different ways to it, but we see that there's a clear approach to how these teams work together on participation. Two, as Irene also already alluded to, it stops being ad hoc. It's not like, okay, we need to do this now. How will we do it? And every time, every team kind of does it in a different way. So it's really important that these lessons are shared. And the third one is about eventually your end users, your community, your residents. Who are you reaching them? How are you reaching them? And if you really think through your participation infrastructure, you will reach the people where they are at on the topics they are interested in. So eventually, it will also benefit your participation. So for today, we want to make it very actionable from the local governments that we're working with. And originally, this started in the UK, but we've distilled 5 ways or 5 tips on how to really improve your workflow today. And Irene has already talked about this workflow, and the tips and ways, they will either cover parts of it or the full kind of workflow. So the first one is really about bringing engagement into one place, centralizing it. Then the second tip is about the beginning of that workflow, about the planning. Then the third one is about scaling it, but still keeping the quality. And then at the end, we want to turn it into insights and eventually close a feedback loop towards the residents. So now we're going to discuss these 5 tips with you. First one.
Bringing engagement into one place. This is or the idea that input collection or collection of like what your community, the public really thinks happens in many different places is a common reality, right? I was alluding to offline and online, but even if we were to zoom in exclusively into the online world as well, I think historically, especially within the public administration, there's been a reliance on like many different tools, lots of different software that has led to or has resulted in a few things, right? Like inefficiencies to start with. Next slide, please. Many departments using different tools, in some cases, duplicity. Departments and teams using 2 different survey tools, for example, to run consultations. Of course, data silos, right? If you are running certain consultations in one platform, and then maybe perhaps you have a case management system that you are running through a different provider, and those data spots are not really talking to each other. You are not being able to tap into them. Increase the spending across tools, but to us, maybe most importantly, a very confusing resident experience. And this is something that when we especially run interviews with residents, we see, right? Like they are ultimately really confused as to why might I need to answer a survey via the municipal website versus, when a tree falls down in my street, I have to download an app to be able to submit that is an issue and I would like it fixed. What we tell the organizations that come to us and that we work with, when they are really facing this problem. And I think this is shared, right? It's partly a legacy for how we used to think also about digital tooling and the stack. But what we first advise is like start by mapping every engagement channel. And you might be a participation officer, you might be an engagement officer, maybe you don't work yet cross departmentally, but we really believe there's like an exercise initially to be done to really build those bridges so you can have a full picture of the ecosystem of tools that every single person is using for input collection, for input management. Once you have that, you will be able to identify where are the gaps, where are the inefficiencies, where are we really creating a very confusing resident experience. And ultimately, the goal is hopefully that you land on a more centralized approach, right? That you identify a platform that suits you, that can serve you across needs. And that those can be, yes, consultative, like I want to run a survey, I want to run a voting or a participatory budgeting process, but it might also have to do with things like event software, emailing software, and you want to have that all that integrated. Next slide, please. Especially the kind of the suite of tooling has been GoVocal's bread and butter, right? Like that, it's really where we spend most of the time in that, at least in the first portion of our existence in the first 10 years, we have provided our organizations with many different ways to consult, many different ways to reach, to blend offline and online, as well as to set up events. And this is an area that will always continue to be a source of especially product and development investment and excitement for us. One organization that we love working with and that we really admire because they are not only ambitious in their efforts, to change how governance is done, but also because they really understand the value of centralizing resident input collection is really the Borough of Newham in London. They run a flagship consultation every year, a participatory budget in process that they call People Powered Places, where they invite the public to decide and vote on how certain portion of the budget, of the municipal budget, will be used. They've been utilizing a wide range of features and tools within our platform, from ideation to voting, really blending offline votes with online votes, leveraging events to close the gap with the public as well. And I think they see it in the numbers, right? Like year-over-year growth in participation, united community around the project, increasing number also of like organizational adoption with over 200 project managers present in the platform, and increasingly many more projects, right, in the platform as well. Even if the participatory project is a big impetus for the usage, it expands across.
Yes. Now over to tip two, which is really the start of the workflow, and that is all about planning, and not only doing the planning, but also making it visible and shared. So I think what we often see as a common starting point is that we see that nobody really has the full picture. Many teams are running engagement often in parallel, which means duplicated efforts and very reactive planning. And we think the fix shouldn't be so complicated. That we're trying to aim for one shared view, so that everyone within the local government can see what's running, what's planned, what's been done. So to really make that visible, but also to be able to revisit it regularly and being able to learn about it and say like, okay, this is what we've done there, what has worked, what can we do better, and eventually getting ahead of things and planning ahead instead of catching up or saying like, oh, all of a sudden there's this urgency to do this project, which is something that we encounter a lot. So how we're doing this with GoVocal, I want to highlight a few features that I think are interesting to do this. First of all, we've launched the calendar view. So this is really now giving a very good overview of what is happening now, what is coming up. So for different colleagues and for your internal teams, it's really a very good overview of what's happening, what's done, and what's coming ahead. Then we have lots of roles, let's say. We have user groups, we have user management. So we can really make sure that both internally you're engaging the right people, but also externally. And then we have also built on top of these roles approval workflows so that depending on how you work, be it centralized or decentralized, every department has their own approach, or there's like a central approach. You can say like, okay, within my department or within my local government, I want to have Irene approve what I've done and eventually publish it. And one city that does this amazingly well is the city of Oslo. We're working together with them since 2024. And before that, they had a very scattered approach. Every neighborhood was doing it in a different way. They didn't really have one central service. So while like building out this platform, they also built out what they call the public participation service. So it's really kind of an internal service that helps every project manager that wants to engage the population of Oslo. And they built this whole process on their platform. So it's quite nice to see how they've built a whole flow of like, okay, what do you want to do? What are your goals, etc. And it also starts to show in the numbers. So we have about 60 internal project managers, but now also about 100 plus of these intake processes consulted, and that's now also resulting in more and more projects being implemented in on the platform.
And as organization, as engagement scales and as the number of people actually engaged from your teams in the organization of and launch of participatory projects also grows, we see a tension between control and autonomy and quality arising, right? And some especially like let's say let's call them the admins or like the people that have been there from the beginning that really understand how engagement is done well, them really grappling with the question of like, do I standardize processes? Do I let control go a little bit? And what we see is a bit of a two approaches. Can you go to the next slide, please, Aline? Some teams that are opting for continuing to maintain things centralized, right? Even if the ambition is really to like create organizational muscle, they still are not comfortable. They want to maintain high standards of quality, so they almost become a bit of a bottleneck. Review everything, don't let let's say the control a bit go. And then we have teams that where we see okay, a bit more openness perhaps for experimentation, but also sometimes comes with like some of the PR hiccups, right? If you don't really have the right standards in place. A lot of the workshops that we host and kind of a bit of the advising that we do around how to set up a bit of that organizational structure, infrastructure, and muscle starts with defining what's good engagement. And there is commonality, there's convergence across organizations on what this means, but there's also some divergence, right? Like it's really dependent to you and your case and like what is required in some cases legally and in other cases by simple practice and historical legacy. So defining what it is, turning that and by using some of the functionality you might have available and at your disposal, turning it into reusable templates, standardizing and really setting the ground for how you want to think of like roles within your platform, right? Like, do you want to take a bit of an approach of like a departmental structure? Or are you not ready for that yet? Do you prefer to go perhaps with more like a super admin structure that has control over the work that implementers do? So there's lots to think about when you set things up. And then also thinking about the ultimate step of whether you are going to move on to blending the offline and the online, or whether you for now are going to stay in a more simple implementation of just collecting online input. Maybe to discuss briefly a couple of things that, or one thing that we are really excited that it's coming up in the next couple of weeks. As we've grown and as we've seen many organizations mature, we've also realized that we want to better support this idea of like workspaces, departments that want to set up their own ways of working, right? From what I was alluding to, roles and permissions, to certain templates that they want to set up that only apply perhaps to the urban planning department versus like, the water sanitation department. So in the next few weeks, we are going to be launching spaces. Yeah, you see it, I think, in the top left corner of this slide. We have many of our organizations already excited about adopting it, especially those, I mean, we were alluding to Newham. Can you imagine 200 plus folks really running projects every day? Lots of need to really structure and organize things a bit differently and set up a bit more of of the philosophy and a bit of the templatization and standardization around it. And then we have in 2025, especially, we devoted quite some time to things like approval workflows that are critical, especially in the public administration, to have high confidence on what's launched, so nothing gets launched, right, with that overview step. And then also understanding that you are very busy. I mean, often I include some GIFs in my presentations when I talk to folks working at the public administration, and it's like the person doing 1,000 things. That's how we imagine you, and we know that you cannot be approving every single step throughout the process. So what we've built is a management feed that also gives you visibility into the actions that the folks in your teams and across departments are taking. So just to mention a few functionalities that can be really leveraged and can help let off control a bit while maintaining a high level of quality assurance.
Thanks, Irene. Fourth tip is the second to last one. So it's about after you've collected all of your input, be it ideation, surveys, voting, etc., how do you then start evaluating it? And how do you analyze and eventually build reports to share it with decision makers within your local government? So I think something that we see often happening today is, I think, two main things. One is more before, I think right now, but there's still quite a bit of manual processing of data. Although AI is starting to be widely adopted, it still happens. So be it, going through lists of ideas or inputting paper forms, it still happens, and people are still using quite losing quite a bit of time on it. And then the second one is not really knowing how you report or how you'll make decisions before you launch the process. And then kind of collecting the input and then afterwards saying like, okay, but what do we now actually want to know? So I think there's two great opportunities. One is like, how can you really use technology to save lots of time and hours on processing all of that data, building it into reports, but then also really thinking through with your colleagues before you get started, like what will we measure? How will we report on it? How will we decide? So that's also clear before you start, and that will be an important factor into how you eventually also build your participation process. Um, so to also turn this into action and on Go Vocal, we use a few different methods or ways, let's say, to make that happen. First of all, AI sense making. That's really an easy tool to, on one hand, summarize lots of open text, but then also to cluster lots of input. Built on top of it, we've built Auto Insights, which is automated insights, and it will kind of do the analysis of all that data, but also try to link it through to the demographics so that you can actually, for example, here it's small, but that you could see, okay, what do people of a certain age actually talk about and what is statistically significant? And there's often lots of interesting insights coming out of this, or things that civil servants really don't realize, and that then makes them actually dig into certain insights a bit more. And then eventually, after you've done all of that analysis, you turn it into reports that can then be easily shared either within your local government or with your community, with the end users. And another case study, and where this has really helped save tons of time, is in St. Louis in the US. They had a big chunk of money that was given to them when the Rams moved out of town. And the board there really said like, okay, we want to listen to our community and let them come up with ideas and priorities of how to spend all of this money. And they had lots of participation and lots of input. And so they used our tool to, of course, on one hand, collect all of this input, but then to also really cluster it into priority areas with AI, with our AI sense making, and then also have some insights into, okay, what are different groups of our community saying, and what can we actually learn about this for future policy making. Over to Irene for the last tip.
And often what we hear from the organizations that we serve and all the customers that we interview is that I wonder if this is also something you all experience, is that it's somewhat easy, in quotes, take it with a grain of salt, but somewhat easy to create excitement at the input collection step, right? It's like, yeah, let's reach out to the community. But it's way harder to rally people behind. And I'm speaking primarily now organizationally, to get to the closing of the loop step, right? To get to the place where you tell the community, this is what we heard, this is what you said, this is what we are going to do, and ultimately also to tell the community, this is how you've influenced the decision, and explain it to management as well. What we see today, next slide, please, is that even if that step that I was just alluding to is the critical step for trust building in the governance exercise you really are doing, is this step that you struggle the most with. Sometimes for lack of capacity, sometimes because of lack of buy-in. Um, and there's we'll see a few quotes as well later on, but this is a point I think also of like excitement from many of the organizations we serve, because they are, the people we work with are real champions of this work. So a lot of the conversations and kind of guidance and work that we do, both on the strategic side, but also to support them by building features that can contribute to this work, has to do with trying to ask ourselves, how do we make sure that buy-in around closing the loop, around connecting the community voice to the decision making is something that is decided at the beginning, right? When you set up the project. How do we make sure that every consultation set in our platform has a closing of the loop step? How do we automate it further? How do we bring insights to you more easily? How do we even connect with third-party systems like Power BI that you might be using to map out and track the evolution of your policy objectives or your local plan objectives, right? Like, how do we make sure that there's some accountability as to how those consultations are mapping back up to what the municipality or the organization said they would do, not in a year, but 10 years from now. So a few of the product domains, if you go to the next slide, I mean, just a few quotes from some people. I wonder if it resonates, but departments check out once they get the data. I'm chasing up colleagues and services to agree on what's going to be shared and when. It's really a challenge, and this comes directly from people that we work with. But some product domains that we've been investing in, and this you should know, it's really an area that we are very excited about. But I was alluding to Power BI, API access, increasingly also leveraged by some of our customers, particularly for this strategic planning dimension, right? To really connect consultation and the engagement work that the organizations we serve are doing, which is so important, but often hard to advocate for because sometimes the connection with the strategic planning is missing. So leveraging the API to really connect with other tools that they are using. And some of our report builder capabilities as well to prove to management some of the value of the work done. More to come on this. We have some exciting plans, but maybe for the next webinar.
Yes. So let's wrap up before we open it up to questions. So it'd be great if, as said already in the beginning, if you take one of these tips along today, tomorrow, next week, and just to summarize them. So the first one is really applying to this whole workflow of centralizing and bringing engagement into one place. The second one is about the beginning of that workflow, about planning, making it visible, shared, so you can plan ahead and don't always start engagements very ad hoc and reactive. The third one is focus on how do you then scale without losing the quality? How do you make sure that you set up qualitative engagement processes? The fourth one is about after you've collected all of that input, how do you turn it into usable insights? And then eventually the importance of closing the feedback loop. So now over to the Q&A. There's three questions. I'll start with the first one, but please do also share other questions in in the Q&A module. By the way, I saw that someone shared participation as an infrastructure is pain, which is, I think, a very interesting abbreviation. So the first one on engagement fatigue. How do you make sure that you're not burning out your community? I think we all really believe in, let's say, customizing it as much as possible. So trying to know what your residents are interested in, where do they live, so that you can really make it very tangible and relevant for them. And then also, if you start having this, let's say, better, if you start adopting that better workflow, it will also become smoother for people to participate. They'll see like the same approach coming back. They'll know what to expect. The expectations are set clear from the beginning. That they know that they can, receive feedback in the end. So that will eventually, hopefully, not create that fatigue. Um, Irene, I have one for you, which is about success measurement, also something that we have spent quite a bit of time on. How would you measure success differently in an always on model versus project by project? How would you approach that?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, such an interesting question. Whoever asked this, it would be good to get coffee and also get your thoughts on this. I think, if we think about it from a product of how can we support a bit of both, because I think over the last 10 years, what we've seen is that there is a bit of a calendar cycle to how the public administrations and the organizations we serve consult. So often they might be looking at it a bit of project by project basis. But then we've also seen that there's value to running, for example, always on community sentiment, longitudinal surveys, right? To always have that kind of like flow of insights, flow of trends coming in. So you have a bit of an early warning system into how you are doing from the perspective of could be quality of service, governance perception, etc. So I would, to me, it's a bit of a, I mean, I'm not trying to cop out, right? But I think it's a probably a more honest answer to say that I think internally, at least, we are building a bit of a measurement system that tracks both.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and maybe in parallel, because this is a bit more of a has been an experimentative track for us to also evaluate what does it mean for a project to be successful. What is an excellent consultation project, and are there dimensions there that we can define, that we can mathematically define and measure across all the organizations we serve to then elevate some benchmarks across them, and to help a bit contribute to this culture of like increasingly having better engagement. It's something we are experimenting with, but we are excited also to bring that data into the product.
Nice. Another one for you, Irene, if I may, which is about the workflows that we propose. How can they be developed by organizations in social society? I think this person is probably, Diogo is probably talking about civil society. Do you want to share your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I wasn't anyways, I was familiar a long time ago with social society. I think it was an emailing service. That's why at first I wasn't fully following. Um, I mean, we work with with organizations, with NGOs as well. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you are referring to. I would say that from a perspective of product and how we think about what we build and kind of what we support, I would say that we are trying to build towards workflows. Like very much we concentrate in the organizations we serve, right? And the majority, I would say, are municipalities. And we think there's power in that, in like really focusing on understanding very well the problems that they are trying to handle. Having said that, having had experience also with NGOs or or other organizations, even foundations that we've worked with, I think the question of like, you needing to consult a community, needing to make them feel heard, needing to get back to them, needing to analyze data in a way that you can stand by, that is just not a chatbot telling you this is what the data says, but like in a way that you can point to the source data providing insights in a way that you know are statistically relevant, even if you didn't have the money to pay a consultant that charges a lot for it, right? Like, I think all those services that our platform provides automatically are very translatable for organizations.
Mhm.
So that's
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I think civil society, of course, also has a, a big role to play in like the engagement local government does with their community. And I think often we see civil society as part of that community. So we will either also engage them in a process. So it can be, just one resident living somewhere, or it can be a group of engaged residents, or it can be actually a civil society organization that shares their view on a certain topic. And then I think we've also seen them being involved in the actual implementation of certain projects or priorities. So, for example, in Ghent, we've also run a big participatory budget, and then you have a group of people. It's like, okay, I want to make this happen. We'll organize ourselves. It can be a civil society organization that already exists or not. But so I think they're definitely part of what we see as the community that local governments are consulting, and that eventually is also implementing and working on making some of these ideas and inputs happen. So with that, I'll wrap up this webinar. Thank you so much, Irene, and to everyone
thank
present
you all.
for your questions. We have a workflow guide, and the full version will be shared with you in your inbox soon. We'll also share the recording of this session, and let us know if ever you want to talk to us. Always happy to think through your workflows. So have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.